Gunpowder Treason and Plot. The Legacy of Guy Fawkes.
January 31st, 1606. The dawn light struggled against the smoke-streaked rooftops of London. The city stirred, burdened with an unease that seeped from every stone. The streets were packed with bodies pressing forward, breath clouding the chill air, all eyes turned to Old Palace Yard. Executions were common, but today it was the name Guy Fawkes that brought them here. I pulled my coat tighter, the rough wool biting against my neck, ink-stained fingers flexing after a night spent writing thoughts I dared not share. Around me, merchants, labourers, and nobles muttered in a dissonant hum. A man beside me, his cloak worn and patched, whispered,
"At last, justice for king and country."
as if reciting a prayer he barely believed. Justice? The word sat heavy in my mind. Guy Fawkes was no shadow to me, but a boy from York who once knelt beside me in hidden chapels, his voice steadfast in forbidden Latin. Now, he was a name smeared across pamphlets, shaped into a villain by hands that had never felt the weight of faith or powder. The scaffold loomed, timbers groaning under their burden. Guy, with shoulders squared, mounted the steps like a soldier marching to battle. It was said in hushed tones that he'd learned the art of fire beneath Spanish skies. A sharp whisper cut through the air.
"A soldier's death for a soldier's crime."
I did not turn. My eyes remained on him, searching for recognition, regret, anything. Thomas Winter's voice still haunted me.
Your words, William, could kindle England's fire.
But I had refused. Whether for fear or reason, I'd held back. Now, as I watched a friend become a spectacle, I wondered which of us was the greater fool. The bells tolled, each chime striking like a drumbeat. Children perched on their father's shoulders, eyes wide with a wonder they could not understand. Silence swept the crowd as the executioner stepped forward. A chill settled deep, one no fire could warm. This was the end of Guy Fawkes, soldier, conspirator, recusant, and it would be carried in whispers and ink long after we were all dust.
Like and subscribe.
I suppose, before this tale winds further, you ought to know who holds the quill. My name is William Kelly, a writer by trade and a Catholic by conviction. Two pursuits that, in this age where whispers are currency and loyalty a blade's edge, make a man tread as if each step could splinter beneath him. I was born in York in 1565, a city that wore its defiance like a badge long before the crown sought to snuff it out. York was a place where faith lingered in the cracks of its stone streets and in the hushed chapels hidden from prying eyes. By the time Elizabeth I reigned, and the year turned to 1585, practicing our faith was not an act of devotion, but one of rebellion. The priest's Latin chants, always subdued, seemed louder than a battle cry when uttered behind bolted doors. And it was in those shadowed rooms, amid flickering candlelight and the scent of cold stone, that I first knew Guy Fawkes. He was a boy then, his eyes already fierce with something more than piety, a fire that would later scorch his path to infamy.
William, you twist your words till they bend into knots, but words won't crack the chains that bind us.
Guy once teased, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had a way of speaking that turned jest into challenge. I, content to let my ink speak of the mundane, knew he was right. Guy always believed in deeds over words, even when we were boys, clutching rosaries and hope alike. By 1590, news from Spain whispered through market stalls, painting visions of Catholic might and grandeur. Guy drank in such stories as though they were scripture, and by 1593, he'd left York for the continent, seeking a place where his faith needed no concealment. I remained, recording the world in cautious ink, my ambitions tethered to the city's grey stones. York carried on, practicing its faith with an ear always attuned to the knock at the door, each fine for recusancy bit deeper as the years stretched on. Even King James's ascent in 1603 brought little respite. His promises of tolerance turned to echoes on the wind. When word came of a man returned from battlefields, changed and sharpened by war, I knew it was Guy. No longer the boy who challenged me in whispered jest, he was a soldier whose stories spoke of fire and faith. Still, York held fast. A city that clung to the old ways as fiercely as Guy did his belief that action could shift the tides. And I, William Kelly, kept my ink and paper, tracing the world's ripples while others reached for storms. The city's memory was a stubborn thing, lingering like the scent of cold stone even in the quiet of my study. I had kept to ink and paper, believing that observing from the edges spared a man the storms that raged at the center. But the world was shifting, and those who reached for storms were knocking at my very door. The candle sputtered on my desk, casting uneven shadows over ink-stained papers and the half-empty bottle of ink that had seen me through many nights of restless scribbling. The streets beyond my shutters hummed with the distant murmur of merchants packing away their wares, the last calls of hawkers, and the occasional bray of a mule. It was an hour when a man should be left to his quiet thoughts, but that evening held its own designs. A knock, deliberate and firm, shattered the quiet of my study. My pulse quickened, a reflex born of times when visits like these bore consequence. I crossed the room, each creak of the boards beneath my feet, a reminder of how fragile safety had become. When I unlatched the door, Thomas Winter stood there, cloaked and wary, eyes shifting as though even the shadows conspired against him. Thomas entered without pause, the air thickening as he stepped inside. His name carried weight in our circles, known for his part in the simmering discontent that had stirred since the king's broken promises. A scholar by reputation, but a plotter by necessity, Thomas had become one of Robert Catesby's most trusted hands, a man who held conviction as tightly as a blade. When the latch clicked shut, the familiar scent of ink and parchment in my study turned sharp with the tension he brought. The lamplight cast harsh lines across his face, deepening the creases of worry and resolve. Words were unnecessary. The look in his eyes spoke of the years since James ascended in 1603, when hopes of reprieve had crumbled into fines and furtive prayers. Peace had proven no more than a thin veil, shredded by Parliament's iron will. We spoke for a while, Thomas and I, our words circling the state of England like carrion birds. When King James took the throne, he had offered a glimmer of hope to Catholics, a reprieve from the relentless fines, the stigma, the hidden prayers behind bolted doors. Many of us had dared to believe that with a king whose mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a martyr of our faith, a softer hand would guide the realm. But those promises, spoken with the ease of a king securing his crown, soon crumbled under the weight of political necessity. Instead of tolerance, we faced Parliament's unyielding eye, the continuation of recusancy fines, and the ever-present threat of imprisonment. The whispers of spies, the betrayals, the heavy coins dropped into coffers as punishment for attending secret masses. These were the truths of our days. Peace had proven as thin as the paper it was whispered on, and the faith of our fathers became a burden, worn quietly, but at great cost. Thomas's gaze swept over the papers on my desk, simple reports and harmless commentary. None with edges sharp enough to cut, none dipped in the ink of dissent. His voice, low and measured, broke the silence.
We cannot move the crown with ink alone, Kelly, but ink can set a spark in men's hearts when deeds need their favor.
A familiar chill settled beneath my ribs. Guy's name flitted unspoken between us. The boy I knew from York, now a man tempered by Spanish battlefields and sharpened by unwavering resolve. His path was fire. Mine, ink. Yet even ink had its price. "I am a writer," I said, my voice firm, though my hands trembled. "But I know what price ink commands. You ask me to lay my name beside yours, where the gallows cast their pall." Thomas did not flinch.
The pall eventually covers us all, William, whether we act or hold our tongues. Better to bear it with purpose.
His words coiled in the air between us, a test and a plea. He reached into his cloak and placed a folded piece of parchment on my desk.
If you reconsider, William, this will tell you where to find us.
His gaze held mine for a moment longer, heavy with expectation. When he turned and left, the room seemed to exhale, leaving behind a silence that pricked at my nerves. The weight of the parchment on my desk felt disproportionate, as though it carried the weight of the gallows themselves. I stood unmoving, his final words and that slip of paper binding me to a choice I had yet to make, an uncharted path that promised more than ink could foretell. It was late October of 1605, and London's chill pressed hard against the city, seeping into stone walls and stiffening the air. The meeting took place in a discreet room at the Duck and Drake, an inn known for its shadows as much as its ale. The room was narrow and low-ceilinged, with heavy drapes drawn tight against the windows to block out the prying eyes of the city. The oil lamps burned low, their dim glow pooling across the rough-hewn walls, etching the men's faces in stark relief, eyes glinting with purpose. I stepped inside, the door creaking on its hinges as it closed behind me. Conversations halted, replaced by the soft rustle of fabric and the crackle of the flames. Catesby stood at the center of the room, commanding with a presence sharpened by resolve. Thomas Winter leaned over the table, hands resting on maps inked with routes and plans. In the corner, Guy Fawkes remained silent, a figure of iron resolve and shadows, his gaze steady as he took in the room. Catesby's eyes met mine, sharp and unwavering, his voice cutting through the silence.
We seek not idle words, but those with the power to stir men's souls, William. Your pen could do more than inform. It could rally, turn whispers into a call that resounds across the realm.
I felt the weight of his request before he even finished speaking. The room, thick with tension and charged with the scent of wax and smoke, closed in as the eyes of every man turned to me. My breath felt tight in my chest. Guy stepped forward from his corner, arms still folded but his voice clear and measured.
We have knelt long enough, bowed beneath the weight of empty promises. The time has come for more than prayers. We need your voice, William.
The flame of the lamp wavered between us, its light shifting with an uneasy flicker as silence deepened. Memories of secret masses in York, the fines paid under Elizabeth's rule, and the hollow promises of King James weighed on me like a great chain. Thomas stepped closer, eyes bright with fervor.
Your words, William, could kindle England's fire.
The silence that followed was suffocating, each man waiting for my answer. They wanted more than ink-stained pages. They sought words that would rally hearts, turn whispers into a call for rebellion, and set the kingdom ablaze with defiance against the crown and parliament. Their cause was no simple plea. It was treason, bold and unrepentant. I felt the weight of their expectation pressing down like an iron shroud, the crackle of the lamp, the only sound cutting through the tension. To lend my hand to this was to wield ink as a weapon, to abandon the safety of the scribe and step into the fire with them. The silence stretched, filled with the thrum of my heartbeat and the weight of their expectation. I felt the pressure of their eyes, the unyielding grip of the choice before me. I drew in a breath that felt heavier than it should. "My course cannot follow yours," I said finally, each word falling like a stone into the room. Disappointment flickered in their eyes, but the silence spoke their acceptance. With gazes upon me, I turned and stepped out into the biting night, the city seeming colder and darker than before. The streets felt narrow, the shadows deepened by what I had left behind. The parchment in my pocket, a relic of their trust, was now a reminder of how close I had come to treason. As I walked, the question gnawed at me with each step. Was it wisdom or fear that stayed my hand? The days after the meeting at the Duck and Drake dragged on, each marked by an uneasy quiet that coiled around the city like mist. November arrived, bringing with it a chill that crept through the narrow streets and gnawed at the bones. I kept to my routines, each action weighed down by a sense of waiting, listening for whispers carried on the wind that hinted at change. Rumors flitted about, vague but insistent. Patrols tightened, faces watched with a keener eye, the crown's gaze searching for discontent. On the morning of November 6th, that silent tension snapped into something tangible. The dawn cast a pallid light through my window, and the frost clung stubbornly to the glass. I sat at my desk, quill idle, the inkpot cold and untouched as I wrestled with thoughts too tangled for paper. The city seemed quieter than usual, its breath stilled by an unspoken dread. A knock at the door shattered that stillness, sharp enough to startle my heart into a gallop. Rising, I crossed the room, each floorboard creaking underfoot as if protesting the sudden movement. I opened the door to find only the fading echo of hurried steps. There on the threshold lay a folded letter, its seal intact but smudged, the edges damp with dew. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a rushed scrawl that spoke of urgency and secrecy. I hurried back inside. The meager light slanted across the floor as I unfurled the letter. The words leapt at me, cold and uncompromising. "Word hath reached the King and Parliament. A missive, bearing warning of treason, did lead them to Guy beneath the House of Lords, where they took him amidst the barrels of powder, defiance yet writ upon his brow. The hunt is now begun, and the names of those complicit shall not remain veiled for long. William, thou must flee. The wind hath turned, and peril draws near. Mark my words, or they shall come for thee as well." A coldness deeper than any morning frost took hold of me. My thoughts flew back to the meeting at the Duck and Drake. The fierce gleam in Catesby's eyes, the steel in Guy's silence. I gripped the edge of the desk, the question searing through my mind. Had my silence kept me safe, or would their ink-stained cause drag me with them? I turned to the window and parted the curtain with a cautious hand. The street below was restless, knots of people speaking in low voices, their breath visible in the chill air. Soldiers paced with watchful eyes, their presence doubled and their movements taut with purpose. The final warning of the letter thudded through my veins. Mark my words, or they shall come for thee as well. With trembling hands, I packed a satchel with the few essentials I could gather, each item chosen with a reluctance that spoke of unfinished days. The letter lay on the desk, a silent witness to the choice that now drove me forward. I cast one last look over the familiar room, the place where I had bent words to my will, seeking truth in a world nurtured on deceit. Stepping into the morning, the cold bit deep, sharp as iron, and my breath curled like smoke before me. I knew not where my path would lead, only that I must leave, must outrun the spectre of what might follow. London felt like a held breath, waiting for the storm to break. With each step, doubt clung to my heels, a reminder that safety was now a fleeting dream. The winter of 1605 laid a cruel, silent claim to the countryside, cloaking it in frost and barrenness. I fled London with urgency, heeding the warnings carried in whispers and hurried notes. York, once a place of familiarity, was too known, too perilous. Instead, I found refuge moving between quieter towns. Norwich, with its twisting lanes, the shadowed edges of Bedford near the Priory, and the outskirts of Coventry, where the market noise masked watchful eyes. The first weeks after fleeing were a trial of nerves. Each path felt jeopardous, every sound a harbinger of betrayal. The chill gnawed at me, but fear gnawed deeper still. News reached me sparingly, smuggled in the folds of letters or whispered by trusted allies who risked the watchful eyes of the crown. From those careful exchanges, I learned the grim details. Guy Fawkes had been caught in the cellar beneath the House of Lords, surrounded by 36 barrels of gunpowder, a cache capable of reducing the Grand Chamber and all within it to ruin. The plan had been as audacious as it was deadly, to ignite the powder as King James, his lords, and leading Protestant figures assembled for the state opening of Parliament. The plotters had dreamed of a blow that would erase decades of persecution with a single, thundering act. Fawkes had been taken to the Tower, where the cold stone walls heard his silence before his groans. Under the torment of the rack, even the most devout man's strength splinters. Bit by bit, names began to spill. Catesby, Percy, Wintour. The Crown's agents hunted the others, driving them north. Catesby and his loyal few made their last stand at Holbecker House, where musket fire cut short their resolve. It was said Catesby died clutching a cross, his faith undimmed even as life left him. King James's court, now fueled by relief and rage, wasted no time. Pamphlets were distributed, painting the conspirators as traitors steeped in devilish schemes. Parliament rallied to pass stricter laws, fines that bled Catholic families dry, and oaths of allegiance that twisted loyalty into submission. The failed conspiracy had sparked the very retribution it sought to end. As I sat by a dwindling fire in the damp confines of a cottage near Coventry, the burden of these revelations weighed upon me. Survivor's guilt gnawed at me like a relentless rat. My pen had not been used for their cause, yet here I was, caught between relief and shame. I was free, but the ink I had wielded so safely felt now like a blade that might still cut me. Each day brought vigilance and waiting. The snap of a twig or the distant thud of hooves made my heart jolt like a hunted stag. One night, after seeking refuge in a modest inn on the outskirts of Coventry, I sat by the dim fire, listening to the low murmur of travelers in the adjoining room. The quiet was broken by a faint rustle at the door. I stood, heart pounding, as a folded letter slipped under the threshold. Picking it up with trembling hands, I unfolded the note, the hastily inked words biting sharper than any winter chill. The plot is dead, but its shadow stirs. Be watchful. By the guttering light, I read those words and knew that the embers of their defiance were not wholly extinguished. They smouldered, buried beneath fear and frost, waiting for someone foolish or brave enough to unearth them. And I wondered if one day, my words, too, would have to tell their tale. An account that neither glorified nor condemned, but simply spoke of the desperate measures of men against a kingdom's iron will. January 31st, 1606. The city shivered under a grip of cold, the breath of winter turning each street and stone to iron. London was restless, murmurs passing like ripples through the gathered crowds. The great spires of Westminster pierced the sky, dark and unyielding against the looming storm clouds. I moved among the throng, a silent witness pulled by the inescapable gravity of the day. Old Palace Yard was alive with bodies pressing forward, eyes sharp with anticipation, their breath coiling into the air as if sharing a collective exhalation. Here, the final chapter of November's plot would be written, and I had come, despite all reason, to see it unfold. The yard was already teeming with people, their breath rising in misty clouds, eyes fixed on the scaffold that commanded the center. The wood groaned under the weight of frost and fate, slick and dark where the cold clung hardest. The crowd shifted restlessly, nobles wrapped in fine clothes, commoners in patched wool, children clutching their mothers' skirts. All gathered to see the conclusion of the plot that had so nearly upended the kingdom. I stood at the edge of the throng, my pulse quickening as I scanned the faces around me, many etched with a mix of awe, disdain, and curiosity. The name Guy Fawkes had been spat from mouths and scratched onto pamphlets, demonized and dissected, but the man who emerged from the dark of the tower was no caricature. Shackled, with a step that faltered only slightly, he was a figure of grim defiance. I remembered him as he once was, the steadfast boy in York, speaking Latin prayers in the candlelit corners where faith thrived in secret. The executioner read the charges aloud, the words thudding like the beat of a drum. High treason, the plotting of mass murder to strike at the king, parliament, and all gathered there that fateful day. The punishment would be a traitor's end, hung until near death, then drawn and quartered. A ritual as brutal as the conspiracy itself. His limbs would be sent to the corners of England, a stark warning that no treachery would go unanswered. The thought turned my stomach. To end a man was justice, but to make a spectacle of his remains seemed a cruelty beyond reason. I glanced at the crowd, some leaning forward in morbid anticipation, and I felt a chill deeper than the cold, an unsettling sense that the scaffold devoured more than just the condemned. Guy stood, his gaze steady, a flicker of defiance still in his eyes as the executioner slipped the noose around his neck. The crowd's murmurs faded, falling into a silence that seemed to sink deep into the cold stones beneath our feet. I held my breath, heart pounding, as he faced his end with the bearing of a soldier, denied his cause, yet unbroken in spirit. The scaffold groaned under the weight of fate, and then, with a grim finality, the rope snapped taut. In that instant, it felt as if the very world recoiled, each creak and crack of the timber a blow against the heart. Those of us who looked on knew that whatever came of this day, a part of our nation's soul hung alongside him. The bells of Westminster tolled, their somber chime cutting through the silence. Children clung tighter to their parents, some turning away, others wide-eyed, absorbing this spectacle that would one day be recounted in half-truths and legends. A mother whispered a hurried prayer, while a nearby man smirked, satisfied that justice had been seen. But justice, I knew, was a fickle companion. What had begun as a desperate bid for freedom ended not with the triumphant roar of change, but with the cold clang of chains and the muffled sobs of those left behind. I stood long after the crowd began to thin, the chill seeping deeper with each passing moment. Thomas Wintour's words ghosted through my mind.
Your words, William, could kindle England's fire.
And they had, in a way none of us had foreseen. Though no spark had touched the powder, the mere knowledge of what could have been ignited flames of repression, a blaze that would consume the hopes of many who dared to speak or dream of change. Turning at last, I stepped away from Old Palace Yard, the weight of the day pressing down with a finality that chilled more than the winter air. London, shrouded in a solemn stillness, seemed to draw breath through clenched teeth, the echo of the execution lingering in every shadow. Guy's voice was stilled, but the tale he had carved into England's heart was far from silenced. Stories would twist, carried by loyalists and recusants alike, shaping him into either villain or martyr. To some, he would be remembered as a symbol of defiance, a man who dared to challenge a throne that wielded power without mercy. The flames that were meant to kindle liberty had instead thickened the gloom of suspicion, forging chains that gripped more fiercely than before. Each step I took echoed with the weight of Guy's failed resolve, a deed that, though crushed, had sown seeds of doubt and unrest. The gnaw of guilt bit deep, for though my silence spared me the scaffold, it bound me to a burden few would carry. The ink I once wielded with conviction now felt like a double-edged quill, poised to either unveil the truth or bend beneath the will of kings. So, when your bonfires crackle and the sky bursts with fireworks each November, do not remember Guy merely as a name committed to flame, but as a man who, flawed and desperate, dared to shake the pillars of power. Remember not only the ashes that bear his effigy, but the ember of defiance that lingers still, and question the freedoms we guard and the unseen chains that tether us. Let his memory stir not just the spectacle of fire, but the uneasy thought of what it means to stand against the tide. For the true echoes of that scaffold reach far beyond this day, a reminder that rebellion, even in failure, leaves its indelible mark on the soul of a nation. Remember, the 5th of November. Gunpowder, treason, and plot. I see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.